On April 14, 1990, an American tourist horse stumbled over a low ridge of sand near the Great Sphinx and tripped on a wall no map had ever recorded. Underneath it lay a tomb, the first of 600, and what those graves held was about to overturn 2,000 years of history. Until that moment, everyone had been told the same story, that 100,000 slaves died building the Great Pyramid, whipped into place under a tyrant king named Khufu. Greek travelers heard it from their guides at Giza around 450 BCE. Roman writers repeated it. School books printed it. Hollywood filmed it. Nobody questioned it for 2,000 years. Until the horse, the wall, and the 600 graves underneath it. Why Giza? The wall belonged to a cemetery. The cemetery belonged to a settlement archaeologists would later name Heit el-Ghurab. Wall of the Crow, after a limestone escarpment running along its northern edge. A conscripted farmer arriving there for the first time would have seen the plateau long before he understood how any of it worked. A shelf of pale limestone rising from the Nile's west bank, swarming at its base with more people and boats than his home village saw in a decade. To understand why a labor camp of this size existed here at all, the plateau itself has to be read the way it was actually chosen, not for symbolism, but for logistics. Giza sits on a shelf of Eocene limestone bedrock solid enough to bear the weight of a structure that would remain the tallest building on Earth for roughly 3,800 years. A record unbroken until the completion of Lincoln Cathedral's spire in the 14th century CE. The quarry supplying the pyramid's core blocks lay less than half a kilometer away. Close enough that some of the stone likely moved on sledges rather than boats. Finer white limestone for the outer casing came from Tura. Across the river, granite for the burial chamber, and the relieving stones above it came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south. Floated downstream on barges built specifically for the job. None of this moved on wheels. Ancient Egypt would not use wheeled transport at any real scale for centuries yet. It moved by water, the same route the farmer himself had likely traveled to get there. The Nile's annual flood was channeled through a system of canals and holding basins that, evidence recovered over the past 2 decades now, suggests reached almost to the foot of the pyramid itself, turning the plateau into something closer to a working harbor than a desert construction site. Boat pits discovered beside the pyramid, one of them still holding a fully assembled cedar vessel when it was opened in 1954, only reinforce how central the river was to the entire operation. Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the fact, got the outline right and the mechanism wrong. A river carried the weight of Egypt's greatest monument. Slaves did not. The workforce system. The pyramid belonged to Khufu, second king of Egypt's 4th dynasty, who took the throne around 2589 BCE and ruled for roughly 23 years. Egypt at that point had no standing army of laborers and no professional construction guild sitting idle, waiting to be called up. What it had was a taxation and conscription system Egyptologists call corvée, a rotating national labor levy, owed to the state in place of currency, that could pull farmers away from their villages during the months when the Nile's floodwaters covered their fields and there was no planting left to do. This was not slavery in the sense Herodotus's guides described it. It was not slavery in the modern sense either. It functioned closer to a mandatory civic duty, something between a military draft and a road labor requirement, and it came with compensation. Bread, beer, meat, medical treatment when injured, and a burial plot within sight of the monument itself, an honor no coerced captive population would ever have been granted. Call this farmer Nacht. No inscription preserves his actual name. None of the ordinary laborers' names survive at all. But the evidence for men like him is abundant enough to reconstruct a composite case. built from the skeletons, the gang graffiti, and one extraordinary logbook. Nakht would have come from a village somewhere along the Nile's middle stretch, conscripted the way most of Khufu's workforce was, called up during Heit, the flood season, when the river covered his fields and there was no planting left to do. He likely arrived at Giza in his early 20s, following the same water route already described, part of a rotating levee that traveled to the plateau every 3 months for 2 decades. That logbook belongs to a mid-level official named Merer, recovered from papyri at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast in 2013, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever found in Egypt. Merer commanded a crew of roughly 200 men who spent their days ferrying limestone from Tura to Giza by boat, a round trip he logged with almost obsessive precision. His entries read like a shipping manifest: cargo tallies, weather delays, notes on a supervising official named Ankhaf, Khufu's own half-brother, who appears to have overseen the final stretch of construction. There is no whip in the diary. There is no chain. There is only a bureaucrat doing his job. 3,500 years before the word bureaucrat existed. And, somewhere in a crew much like Merer's, Nakht himself, hauling stone toward the largest construction site the ancient world had ever assembled. The slave story that would later attach itself to men like Nakht did not originate with Herodotus, and it did not end with him. It traveled through Roman writers, survived the medieval Arab historians who visited the plateau, and found new life again in the 19th century, when European Egyptologists, working in an era of colonial administration across much of Africa, projected their own assumptions about forced labor onto a civilization they had barely begun to read. Napoleon's scholars, cataloging the plateau in 1798, repeated the slave narrative without questioning it. 20th century cinema cemented it further. Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, The Ten Commandments, staged the pyramid's construction as a scene of captives under the lash, an image with no basis in the archaeological record. By the time Lehner and Hawass began their work in the late 1980s, the myth was not simply old, it was load-bearing, holding up centuries of assumption about how ancient states must have functioned. Organizing the workforce. What the diary and the settlement reveal together is a workforce with real internal structure, closer to a modern army's table of organization than to a mob shoving stone uphill. Laborers were divided into large units the Egyptians called zao, translated loosely as gangs, each numbering somewhere near 2,000 men. Graffiti scrawled in red ochre on blocks deep inside the pyramid's core. Invisible for 4,500 years, until the relieving chambers above the burial vault were finally opened, preserves 2 of these gang names. One called itself Friends of Khufu. The other, apparently unbothered by the king's memory, called itself Drunkards of Menkaure, a reference to a beer ration, not an accusation of incompetence. Each gang split further into 5 philes, an Egyptological borrowing from the Greek word for tribe, bearing names that echo nautical terms: great, starboard, prow, terms that hint the organizational language of the crews may have started with the boat teams who first moved the stone up the Nile. Each phyle broke down again into work units of 10 to 20 men, sometimes labeled with a single hieroglyph standing for an abstract virtue: life, endurance, perfection. Nakht, on arrival, would have been sorted the same way every conscript was, assigned to one of the great gangs, then to one of its 5 philes, then to a work unit of 10 to 20 men marked by a single hieroglyph, if he served, as many did. In the phyle called Great, within the gang known from the pyramid's own graffiti as Friends of Khufu, his unit's name might have been Endurance, a label that reads less like a badge and more like an instruction. He did not simply carry stone at Giza. he carried it as a member of endurance. Within Great, within the Friends of Khufu, answerable to an overseer whose title, Overseer of the Side of the Pyramid, in one surviving inscription, suggests the monument's four faces each had their own dedicated chain of command. Modern estimates, built from the physical size of the settlement and the pace required to finish a structure of over 2.3 million blocks in roughly 2 decades, put the core, permanent workforce somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people at any given time. That is a fraction of Herodotus's 100,000. It is still enormous. Rotating conscripts cycling through on 3-month tours, drawn from villages the length of the Nile Valley, Nakht among them, may have pushed the total number of Egyptians who touched the project across its full duration well into 6 figures, which is perhaps how a garbled version of 100,000 survived 2,000 years of retelling in the first place. At the top of this entire structure stood one man, Hemunu, Khufu's vizier and, based on his surviving titles, the closest thing Egypt had to a chief engineer. A seated statue of Hemunu, recovered from his mastaba tomb a short walk from the pyramid he likely designed, shows a heavy-set man with the confident, well-fed bearing of someone who never once carried a block himself. That contrast matters. The gap between Hemunu's statue and a farmer like Nakht is the gap the whole project ran on. A small class of literate administrators translating a king's ambition into ration schedules and shipping timetables, and a much larger body of conscripted men turning those schedules into stone actually set in place. Payment did not run through anything resembling currency. Egypt in the 26th century BCE had none. It ran through a controlled economy of bread, beer, cloth, and meat, issued in fixed quantities tied directly to rank. How they ate. Feeding a workforce this size every single day for 20 years was its own engineering problem. And the archaeology of Heit el-Ghurab answers it in more detail than almost any other ancient labor site on Earth. Mark Lehner's excavations, running from 1988 onward under the Ancient Egypt Research Associates, uncovered a bakery complex on the settlement's southern edge capable of turning out thousands of loaves in a single production run. The bread was made in 2 stages. First, a thick dough of emmer wheat went into shallow ceramic pots called beja. Then the pots were stacked and fired a second time inside open pits, producing a coarse, dense loaf that stored and traveled well. Nothing like the soft, leavened bread of a modern kitchen. Beside the bakeries stood breweries of comparable scale, converting barley mash into a thick, nutrient-heavy beer that worked less as a recreational drink than as a caloric staple, safer to drink than untreated Nile water, and dense enough in carbohydrates to substitute for an entire meal. For Nakht, the day likely ended the way it began, in line, bread first. Dense, twice-baked loaves pulled from reed baskets straight out of the settlement's ovens. Then a ration of thick barley beer, poured from jars stamped with the seal of whichever Delta estate had shipped it that month. Then, on the days his unit's number came up in the rotation, a portion of meat carved from cattle, driven in from pastures he would never see in his lifetime. None of it was generous by the standard of a noble's table. All of it, calorie for calorie, was likely more than a Nile Valley farmer ate at home in an ordinary season. The scale of the meat supply is what really separates this settlement from an ordinary Egyptian village. Faunal remains recovered from the site's refuse heaps, cattle, sheep, and goat bone in enormous quantities, were analyzed by zooarchaeologist Richard Redding, who calculated an annual slaughter approaching 4,000 head of cattle and 21,000 sheep and goats. Delta pastures and outlying estates, some of them specifically taxed in meat rather than grain, appear to have supplied this demand on a fixed schedule. arriving at Giza the way modern military logistics move rations to a front line. A dedicated fish processing area, identified along the settlement's eastern edge, adds another layer. Workers there gutted and dried catfish and tilapia in bulk, a preservation method that let protein travel and store the way the twice-baked bread did. Granaries built into the site's western zone held reserves large enough to buffer against a bad shipment or a delayed delivery. None of this was improvised, season to season. It was budgeted, years ahead of the stone that would eventually need cutting, where they slept. Housing at Heit el-Ghurab followed the same organizational logic as the labor gangs themselves. At the heart of the site, excavators uncovered a set of long, narrow structures, now known simply as the galleries. 4 rows of rectangular buildings, each row divided into individual units roughly 6 meters wide and 30 meters long, capable of sleeping between 40 and 50 men apiece in an arrangement Lehner has compared to a military barracks. At night, Nacht would have slept in one of these with 30 or 40 other members of his unit, packed close enough that the sound of the group breathing and shifting on reed mats became its own kind of background noise. Total gallery capacity runs somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 workers in this section alone. Likely a portion of a single rotating shift, with the wider body of conscripted laborers probably housed in structures that have since eroded or lie buried under modern development on the plateau's edge. Status showed up clearly in the layout. Higher-ranking residents, overseers, scribes, administrators whose clay ceilings and inscribed door jambs turn up in the settlement's northern zone, lived apart. In larger houses with private courtyards, a physical hierarchy that matched the chain of command visible in the work gang titles. Between the two zones sits a structure Lehner's team nicknamed the Royal Administrative Building. Unusually thick walls, a commanding sightline over the plateau. Almost certainly the seat of the officials who kept the accounts Mirror's diary exemplifies. Water delivery at this density required planning of its own. The same canal network that floated stone from the quarries also carried drinking water and doubled as drainage. Copper tools, thick ash deposits from ongoing cooking fires, and rows of grain storage silos found throughout the site all point toward a population that expected to stay, season after season, rather than one hauled in for a single push and abandoned. The permanence of the settlement raises a harder question about who actually lived there full-time. Rotating conscripts like Nacht cycled through on roughly 3-month tours before returning home for planting season. But bakers, brewers, potters, copper workers, and the scribes who tracked all of it had no planting season to return to. Ceilings and administrative debris suggest a resident population of craft specialists who stayed at Giza year-round, some for the entire 20-year span of the project, raising families on the plateau in a way the seasonal laborers never did. How they survived, and when they didn't. It was likely in his second or third rotation that a man in Nacht's position faced the greatest danger. The granite beams destined for Khufu's burial chamber weighed close to 80 tons, even routine limestone blocks. At 2.5 tons apiece, could shift on a sledge track and crush whatever was beneath them when a rope slipped or a runner caught in soft sand. If Nacht's leg had been pinned under a slipping block, a scenario the skeletal record makes clear happened often enough to leave a pattern, his crew would not simply have left him behind. The clearest evidence of how this workforce was actually treated comes not from the settlement, but from its dead. The cemetery the tourists' horse stumbled onto in 1990 holds roughly 600 burials, arranged in a hierarchy that mirrors the one visible in the housing above it. The tombs of overseers, inscribed with their names and titles, ringed by the smaller, unmarked graves of ordinary laborers. Skeletal analysis conducted by Egyptologist Aza Sari el-Din, alongside physical anthropologist Wilfred Griggs, found that most of these men died in their 30s, a life expectancy broadly consistent with the general Old Kingdom population. Not the markedly shortened lifespan sustained brutal treatment would predict. What stood out instead was the evidence of care. Bones showed healed fractures in arms and legs, several with the kind of clean, well-aligned union that indicates a splint had been set, and set correctly, by someone who understood what they were doing. That is what would have happened to a man like Nacht. Weeks of reduced duty, rather than a forced return to full labor, and rations that continued whether or not he could still carry a full load. 2 individuals in the burial record survived amputations entirely, one a leg, one an arm, with the bone remodeled and healed at the site of the wound, meaning both men lived on for years afterwards, fed and sheltered rather than left to die of infection. One skull shows signs of trepanation, a surgical perforation of the bone, with healing visible at the margins of the hole. The patient survived an operation this invasive, performed with Bronze Age tools, 4,500 years before germ theory reached anyone. Whether Nacht himself ever lay on that surgeon's mat is something no inscription will ever confirm. What the bones confirm is that if he had, the odds were with him. None of this means the work was gentle. It was not. Quarrying, hauling, and setting blocks that averaged 2.5 tons apiece was punishing and genuinely dangerous labor. Mehrer's diary records a schedule that allowed rest roughly once every 10 days, sometimes only a half day. Crushed limbs, falls, and heat exhaustion must have been common. The cemetery's own record of healed trauma proves as much. But a workforce whose injured were splinted, operated on, and then buried with dignity within sight of the monument they died building is not the workforce Herodotus's guides described 2,000 years later. The pace of the work. Herodotus also passed down a number for how long the Great Pyramid took to build: 20 years. That figure has held up remarkably well against modern engineering analysis. Completing a structure of roughly 2.3 million blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each. Inside that window means the crews needed to quarry, transport, and set a block every few minutes across a full working day, year-round, for 2 decades straight. Every gang, Nacht's included, worked against a deadline nobody stated aloud but everybody understood. A king's tomb had to be ready before the king died, or his afterlife would have nowhere finished to receive him. That pressure, more than any foreman's threat, is likely what kept crews moving at the pace Mehrer's logbook describes. Before any of it reached the harbor, the stone first had to be cut and dragged, and the tools for that stage were startlingly modest. Quarrymen worked copper chisels and dolerite pounding stones against the limestone, wearing the softer copper down constantly and requiring a steady resupply chain of its own. Once cut blocks moved on wooden sledges rather than rollers. The wheel would not appear in Egypt for another 1,000 years or more. And for a long time, no one could fully explain how so few men, by tomb painting evidence, seemed able to drag such enormous loads across open sand. In 2014, physicists at the University of Amsterdam found part of the answer. Testing sand under laboratory conditions, they discovered that dampening it just enough could cut the friction against a sledge's runners by half. Their inspiration came directly from a tomb painting at Deir el-Bersha, showing a man pouring water on the sand just ahead of a colossal statue being hauled by dozens of workers. A detail dismissed for decades as ceremonial before the physics confirmed it was practical. Whether Nacht's own team used this technique or simply hauled dry rope over exhausting rope is unknowable in any specific case. Only the physics of both methods has now been confirmed. Mehrer's logbook, covering roughly the final years of construction, describes a shuttle system running almost like clockwork. Boats loading limestone at Tura, sailing to Giza on a timetable tight enough that officials tracked it nearly day by day. unloading at a harbor basin near the pyramid's base, then turning around for the next haul. How the stone climb from that harbor to the pyramid's upper courses is still debated. Some Egyptologists favor a long external ramp, built up and dismantled as the structure rose. Others now argue for an internal ramp, spiraling within the pyramid's own core and removed once the outer casing went on. A hypothesis strengthened by cavities detected deep inside the monument using cosmic ray muon scanning in 2017. Whichever method dominated at which stage, the underlying truth does not change. This was not brute force thrown at a problem until it gave way. It was logistics, refined across a generation, executed by men who expected to eat well, sleep under a roof, and see a doctor if a block crushed a hand. After Khufu. Khufu died around 2566 BCE, likely before every finishing touch on his monument was complete. Causeway reliefs and satellite structures continued under his successors, even after the core pyramid stood finished. His son Djedefre, whose own pyramid at Abu Rawash was left unfinished at his death, may have redirected part of the Giza workforce north for a time. The core system stayed intact regardless. Corvée conscription, gang and file organization, a purpose-built settlement to feed and house the crews, and it passed to Khufu's successors at Giza almost without interruption. Noct's own service, if the standard 3-month rotations held, would have ended and resumed a dozen times across those 20 years, cycling between Giza and whatever village he called home. Some men in his position aged out of the levy once their strength gave out. Others, the long-serving unit members and craft specialists, stayed on through Khafre's reign and into Menkaureh's. Their names never recorded. Their labor legible only in the stones still standing today. Khafre, ruling from roughly 2558 to 2532 BCE, built the plateau's second pyramid, a few meters smaller at its base than his father's, but set on higher bedrock. So that seen from the valley floor, it still appears to stand taller than the Great Pyramid beside it. Next to it rose the Great Sphinx, likely carved from a leftover limestone outcrop, too flawed to be quarried into transportable blocks. Whose face it actually shows is still argued over today. Most Egyptologists read it as Khafre's own, though the case has never fully closed. Menkaure followed with a third pyramid, noticeably smaller than the first two. A visible drop in ambition some Egyptologists read as the first sign of strain in a system 3 generations deep. Completed, according to some ancient accounts, by his son Shepseskaf after Menkaure's own death. Even a system this refined, it seems, could not entirely outrun the mortality of the king it served. After Menkaure, the age of pyramids on this scale ended at Giza for good. The pyramids simply stopped growing. The 5th and 6th dynasties that followed built smaller, cheaper monuments, redirecting Egypt's resources toward sun temples and eventually toward a decentralization of royal power that helped bring the Old Kingdom to a close within roughly a century and a half of Khufu's death. Whether the sustained demand of 3 generations of Giza pyramids helped drain the treasury and strain the provinces that later broke from central authority is a question historians still argue over. The record this far back simply is not detailed enough to say for certain. One of several places where honest uncertainty has to stand in for a clean answer. After Khufu. Whether Noct himself is among the 600 graves the horses stumble first uncovered will likely never be known. The workers' cemetery yields bones, not names, for all but a handful of overseers. But the pattern those bones preserve is beyond dispute. Healed fractures, successful amputations, survived surgery, and burial with dignity within sight of the monument these men spent 20 years raising. The same 600 graves this account opened with finally proven to hold something other than what Herodotus's guides had claimed. Khufu's own name survived on ancient king lists for millennia before anyone thought seriously to ask who had actually cut and carried his stone. That question only found an answer starting in 1988, when Lehner began mapping Heit el-Ghurab in earnest, and again in 1990, when a stumbling horse forced Zahi Hawass's team to open a cemetery no one had gone looking for. Excavation continues today under the Ancient Egypt Research Associates, and new techniques keep adding detail that Herodotus's guides never had access to. DNA and isotope analysis of teeth recovered from the workers' cemetery, still ongoing, aims to determine how many of the buried came from the Nile Delta, how many from Upper Egypt, and how many may have traveled from further afield still. The muon scanning surveys that found unexplained cavities inside the Great Pyramid in 2017 continue as well, chasing chambers no camera or drone has yet reached. Most of this work is now led by Egyptian archaeologists themselves, a shift from earlier decades when foreign missions dominated the plateau's excavation permits. Hawass, who went on to serve as Egypt's Minister of State for Antiquities Affairs, built much of his career on precisely this discovery. The plateau itself, listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1979, now draws millions of visitors a year, most walking past the workers' cemetery without knowing it sits there, still just south of the Sphinx enclosure, a few hundred meters from where a horse once stumbled. Modern Egypt remains, in a fairly direct way, in the same working relationship with this plateau that Khufu's administrators were. The same limestone, the same river, the same basic problem of feeding a large workforce efficiently. Still being solved today by archaeologists, guides, and villagers living within sight of the pyramids. For 4,500 years, the Great Pyramid told visitors everything about its scale and almost nothing about the people who built it. What finally broke that silence was not a lost text or a pharaoh's confession. It was the ordinary residue an ordinary settlement leaves behind. Bread molds, beer jars, a healed bone, a name scratched in red ochre on a block no one was ever meant to see again. Somewhere under the sand still left unexcavated at Giza. More of that residue is waiting. It may yet answer the questions the horse, the wall, and Mark Lehner's trowel have not reached, including perhaps whether a man like Nacht ever existed at all, or whether that is simply the name this account gave to thousands of men who did.